if I remember correctly, got it. If I remember correctly, want to limit this to 15 minutes, right?
You don't. We have a little bit more time than that.
Okay. Well, it's always better to tell the speaker, yeah, 15 minutes is good, because that way it'll be within a half an hour. So anyway, thanks for inviting me. Well, first off, I didn't speak before, but now that I have the floor, I'm actually thumbs down on pumpkin spice, although I am very much entertained by the spoof commercial on John Oliver's show. I don't know if you've seen that. Pumpkin spice latte. Yes. That part's good. But thanks for inviting me. This is actually a very familiar environment for me. I have served on several community councils over the years, and I'm still a member of the Wallingford Community Council. And so thanks for all that you do to support your community and then time and energy that you put into that. As was mentioned, I'm an architect, and until quite recently, I split my time equally between teaching and practice. I had my own practice for about 25 years. I now teach full time. But so I have I'm very familiar with the architecture and urban design.
No, he muted.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I accidentally muted you.
So I'm, even though I'm full-time at the university now, and this is a design studio behind me, that's where we do our work. I teach design and professional practice. I still view the world not as an academic, but as a practitioner. So I thought, let's make sure my screen share works now. Okay. So there were a couple things that I wanted to cover. I'm assuming the screen is visible.
Yes.
Yes, it is.
And the first was to just answer some questions about the name change from single family to neighborhood residential. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about the work that the Planning Commission has been doing related to this issue. And then I would also encourage you, if you can, to have Erin Howes from Councilmember Mosqueda's office come back and talk to you more about at least Councilmember Mosqueda's viewpoint from a legislative side, because that position is very different than the Planning Commission, and I'll explain that in a second. But Anne had sent some specific questions that I wanted to answer, and one was, how will the name change or the change from single family areas to neighborhood residential areas impact a neighborhood like Rainier Beach? And the answer is there's really no impact. This is a change in name only. There's not a zoning change. Now, the name change actually originated with the Seattle Planning Commission. There were a couple of reasons why we thought that even without any zoning change, the city should change the name. One of the reasons was that single family zoning has really been a misnomer since 1994, when we allowed accessory dwelling units in single family zones. So at that point, we actually allowed 2 households, not 1 family, but 2 families in our neighborhoods. In addition, we have a wide variety of households in the city. We have households that consist of unrelated adults who are living together. We have households that are multi-generational, increasingly so as we have a expanding immigrant population. So we just felt that the name single family didn't adequately describe what these neighborhoods really are. In addition, the mixed-use multifamily buildings that you see around the city typically fall into a zoning category called neighborhood commercial. Even though they're primarily residential buildings, they have commercial on the ground floor. And so it seemed that having a name like neighborhood residential kind of made sense as a companion piece to neighborhood commercial zoning. Another question that was asked, which I thought was a really good question, which is, how were the 14 targeted neighborhoods chosen to be changed from single family to neighborhood residential? And why weren't more affluent neighborhoods like Laurelhurst and Magnolia included? And the answer is that actually all of the city previously designated as single family, including Laurelhurst and Magnolia, have been revised to neighborhood residential. The reason it appeared in the legislation that some neighborhoods were included and others were not is that any reference to single family areas in the comprehensive plan text had to be revised to neighborhood residential legally. And that includes all of these parts of the comprehensive plan text that I just mentioned. So by my count, there were actually 17 neighborhoods that were specifically listed in the legislation. And that's because those neighborhoods have plans in the comprehensive plan that specifically reference single family areas, and they had to be revised. So it appeared that some neighborhoods were included and some were not, but the reality is all areas that were previously called single family are now called neighborhood residential. So hopefully that answers those two questions. And if there's still some confusion about that, I'm happy to discuss it further. Is all pretty clear? Okay. So now I'm going to move on to the Planning Commission, and first I should explain what the Planning Commission is. So I've served on the commission for 3 years. Why is it doing that? Oh, okay. This is really annoying. I think it's going to start automatically advancing my slides, so I'll have to keep going back. So I've served on the commission for 3 years. I'm now the co-chair. The commission consists of volunteers. We are appointed by the mayor and city council to advise them on issues of land use, housing, and transportation. But we have no legislative authority. We are simply advisors. We represent different disciplines, from architecture to planning, to transportation planning, to housing, to public health. And we come from different neighborhoods throughout the city. In addition to being briefed a lot by various city departments and commenting on plans and activities that the departments have, we also have our own projects, kind of research projects that we work on. And those usually result in reports that we provide to council, the mayor's office, city staff, but also to the public at large. And these are two examples of these that were recently done: Evolving Seattle's Growth Strategy and A Racially Equitable and Resilient Recovery, which was really prompted by the pandemic. And I'd be happy to send Anne or anyone else links to these, and those can be shared. Sorry. But the one I'm going to focus on was a report that we released in late 2018 called Neighborhoods for All: Expanding Housing Opportunity in Seattle's Single Family Zones. And we really wanted to do a deeper dive than had been done previously, looking at our single family neighborhoods and asking the question, are they equitable? Are they adequately responding to our climate crisis? And if not, are there ways that we could maybe begin to rethink how these neighborhoods could function, how they could be made more equitable, and how they could actually be made more livable in the process? The report consists of a series of observations and recommendations, as well as some broad proposed strategies, but I'm really going to focus on the observations at the moment. And so why were we looking at this issue? Well, the main reason, which is quite familiar to everyone at this point, is that we're experiencing a housing affordability crisis. And there's a lot of complicated reasons for that. But the primary reason is that we're simply not building as much housing as we need to accommodate the number of people that are moving into the city. Most of this is related to job growth. And in fact, for about the past decade, we've been building we're building a lot of housing, but we're really only building about half the amount of housing that we really need to be building to accommodate our growing population. And so the report also does a brief overview of zoning history within the city, starting in the 1920s, when we had our first zoning ordinance. Around that time, we also had racially restrictive covenants that really determined where in the city people could live on the basis of race, followed by redlining in the 1930s. The city actually continued to expand single family zoning from the 1950s to the 1980s. In other words, we had areas and neighborhoods that allowed duplexes and triplexes, and we downzoned those to single family throughout that 30-year time frame. In the 1990s, mostly because, not mostly, entirely because of the state mandated Growth Management Act, the city legalized accessory dwelling units. These were attached accessory dwelling units. We didn't legalize detached accessory dwelling units or backyard cottages until 2010. But the city also established the urban village growth strategy, which is the way the city has been managing its growth to date, and it continues to do so today. You may or may not be familiar with the urban village growth strategy. Rainier Beach is one of the urban villages in the city. They come in three types: urban centers, places like downtown and the University District, which are the most dense; hub urban villages, places like Ballard, which are the next dense; and then residential urban villages like Rainier Beach. Now, the urban village growth strategy has done some really good things over the last 25 or so years. It's really a strategy that's designed to add additional people, increase density in close proximity to frequent transit. And before the pandemic, it was doing a pretty good job of increasing per capita transit ridership in the city. In fact, we were one of the few cities in the country to have expanding per capita transit ridership. But there is a flip side to it as well. It was also used back in the mid-1990s as a strategy for single-family homeowners to ensure that their neighborhoods would not have to absorb additional growth. And so, like virtually every city in the US, growth in Seattle has been shaped by a history of systematic government-led racial segregation in which people of color have been denied access to home ownership, which is the most powerful wealth building tool we have available to most households in the US. And single family zoning was one of those strategies. This is Harlan Bartholomew. He, I believe, was a city engineer in St. Louis, but he advised dozens, if not more, cities around the country on their original zoning codes, including Seattle. And when racially restrictive zoning was made illegal in the 1920s, Bartholomew would advise cities, and we believe Seattle as well, that they could still continue to segregate their cities by race by using strategies like single family zoning. And the principle was pretty simple. If you establish minimum lot sizes and if you mandate detached houses, you'll simply make that housing more expensive. In fact, you'll make it expensive enough that it will by default segregate the city by class and race. This actually was a plan. So today, this is a little bit out of date. About 70% of Seattle's residentially zoned land is zoned now neighborhood residential, but still for detached single family houses at suburban densities. Whereas only 25% of the city's residentially zoned land, or now about 30% of the city's residentially zoned land, is zoned for multifamily structures. At the same time, most of Seattle's investments, public investments in schools, parks, playgrounds, and the like, are located within single family zones. Most affordable housing in the city, which could actually most benefit from a lot of those public amenities, are actually located further away in multifamily zones. So over the past decade, as we know, the city has been growing pretty quickly. Only 5% of the city's growth has taken place in the 75% of its residentially zoned land that's zoned for single family structures. 95% of the city's growth has taken place in the 25% of its residentially zoned land that allows multifamily buildings. And so the Planning Commission's argument is that this is really not an equitable distribution of growth. A lot of folks are concerned about changes in single family neighborhoods. And I should note that I'm a single family homeowner myself, and I have a house with an accessory dwelling unit. That changes in zoning in single family will create changes in the neighborhood, but the neighborhoods actually are changing as modest houses are being demolished and replaced by much, much larger single family houses. You can see the graph below that shows the expansion of the average size of a new house built by year. And on the right, you can see some images. These were taken by me in my neighborhood, which has been experiencing this quite a bit. I live between Wallingford and Green Lake. And these were modest houses demolished, replaced by houses twice, if not three times the size. And at the bottom right, you can see a case in which two lots with two houses, both houses were demolished, the lots were joined together, and a much larger single family house was created in its place. At the same time, in some of the city's more affluent neighborhoods, population is actually declining while the city is growing. Now, most of this is simply the result of smaller household sizes. It's just demographics. But nonetheless, the trajectory that we're on in a number of neighborhoods around the city is a smaller number of people living in an expanding amount of square footage, which has a devastatingly negative impact on both housing affordability and climate. The other thing that this has created is what you could call a dichotomy of housing types. In other words, we have lots of single family houses. We have lots of apartments in large apartment buildings on arterial streets, but we actually have very little housing in between. And so this has become a bit of an issue, especially earlier in the pandemic, where social distancing was critical and access to open space was limited, where the folks who have porches and backyards, like me, also have the best access to parks and playgrounds, while people living in apartment buildings on arterial streets actually have less access to those amenities. And so what is, we believe in the Planning Commission, what is really being called for is what has come to be called missing middle housing. This is a term that was coined by an architect in the Bay Area. On the far left, you see the detached single family houses. On the far right, you see the large apartment buildings. In the middle are things like duplexes, triplexes, small courtyard apartment buildings, buildings that have more access to on-site open space, that provide greater opportunities for more affordable home ownership, and that can allow more people to live in closer proximity to transit, in closer proximity to parks and playgrounds, and in closer proximity to things like neighborhood commercial districts. And so where this is leading, and we're just beginning to have these conversations in the Planning Commission, is the next major update to Seattle's comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan is the document that really guides land use, transportation, and housing policy, among other policies in the city. The major update occurs about once every 8 years. We're running about a year behind because of the pandemic. It's just getting started now. Council will be voting on the major update to the comprehensive plan in probably spring of 2024. So basically the process is will be led by the Seattle Office of Planning and Community Development, which with lots of other departments. Various themes for the comprehensive plan will be developed. They will be made public. There will be lots of discussion about these things. And then these various themes or alternatives, as they'll ultimately be called, will go through an environmental assessment called an environmental impact statement process. So basically a third-party consultant will evaluate them based on a series of criteria. This will all again be re-presented to the public and to council. There will be a series of open public hearings where the public can comment, and eventually council will vote on these alternatives. And these alternatives, let's take, for example, neighborhood residential, formerly single-family zoning. These alternatives could span from no change. Let's look at what happens as the city grows if we just keep zoning exactly the way it is, to what happens if we allow more flexibility in different ways, and what might the impact and benefit to those different strategies be. So this is just getting started. I would encourage all of you individually and as a community club to track this and be involved in this conversation, because in the Planning Commission, we really believe this is an extraordinary moment in the world, in the country, in the city, where we are dealing simultaneously with a housing affordability crisis, a climate crisis. We have a greater awareness and reckoning related to social justice and social equity. The pandemic has both exacerbated and made these discrepancies in social equity much more visible. And so we really believe that this is the most consequential major update to the comprehensive plan in the city's history. This is a moment for action on the part of the city to address a lot of the crises that we're facing. And again, I'm only speaking on behalf of the Planning Commission, not any other city department or city council or the mayor's office. I think that is all I have. And I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. I have a question. You had said, tracking it, and I would like to track it. Where is there a
The best, I think the best way would be to go to the city's website. If you Google Seattle Comprehensive Plan or Seattle Comprehensive Plan Update. Now, okay, this is actually a little complicated. You will need to make a distinction, because there are two different kinds of updates to the comprehensive plan. One is the annual update to the comprehensive plan. And so that last happened in 2020. But this is the major update to the comprehensive plan. And so the city does have a platform set up for this, so that you can go and you can see what the schedule is going to be. You can see where there are opportunities for public input. Eventually, when the public hearings will take place, that will be done by council. An interesting question. Right now, all of these things are happening online, and whether or not they will continue to happen online, or whether some of them will be in person, I don't know. I'm sure that's a conversation that is taking place within the city right now.
So Rick, you described that, what comes out of this comprehensive plan could be anything from no change to more flexibility. That flexibility could include, for our neighborhood, for example, allowing duplexes, triplexes, or apartment buildings, or allowing subdivision of lots to increase density.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is it could be any of those things. I'm not really in a position to say what it will be. even in the planning commission, and again, just to make it clear, we are only advisory. We don't literally do anything other than advise council and the mayor's office. We are just beginning to have conversations regarding what we think might be some strategies and alternatives. So it would be inappropriate for me to say anything specific about what it might be, because I
No, but
literally
in
don't
your-
know. Yeah,
in
but
your range of possibilities, that's. you know,
sure, it could be those sorts of things, or it could be no action. I mean, the city did relatively recently pass accessory dwelling unit legislation that allows for 2 accessory dwelling units on every parcel above a certain size. And I want to say it's, don't quote me on this, I want to say it's minimum size of 2,800 square feet. So we already allow 3 units on all parcels, and the city just released a report that shows that has led to an increase in the production of accessory dwelling units, which was really the point of doing it. I'm sure one of the studies I'm not sure, I would speculate, I would assume that one of the studies that the city would do would be saying, okay, let's have a projection of how many additional units are going to be produced based upon the current pattern that we're seeing. And what does that really mean in terms of allowing for more growth within the city? One thing that is a little bit of a limitation, and I'm just speaking for myself here, but is a little bit of a limitation with the accessory dwelling unit strategy, is it doesn't necessarily open up a lot of additional opportunities for home ownership. There are cases in which some of these accessory dwelling units, say you have a main house and 2 accessory dwelling units on a parcel, some of them are being turned into condominiums right now. So in that case, it actually is providing more opportunities, more affordable opportunities for home ownership. The city's not really taking a position on that one way or the other. It's just something that's happening, but it definitely is more complicated than if you were able to just subdivide the lot into 3 separate lots and have 3 separate units on it. But that is something that's already happening.
Rick, will any of these changes in the zoning regulations and all those other things you've been talking about have any sort of material effect one way or the other on displacement?
Great question. That is the question of the hour. It's a really complicated question. There's no simple answer to that. I will say it's something that is front and center in all of these conversations. One thing that we're doing in the commission is we're talking to both city departments and a wide range of mostly housing related organizations that are really focused on what are some effective strategies for mitigating displacement. I think one of the goals would be, how do we not only allow for more people to live in these neighborhoods and benefit from the neighborhoods, but also how do we ensure that people who are already living in the neighborhood are benefiting from these changes in zoning as well and are not forced out of the neighborhoods? So it's a complicated question. It's one that we're looking into in the commission. It's one that I know is front and center for the city as well. And when I said that we're looking at different strategies, we're also looking nationally. We're looking at what other cities are doing in terms of the displacement question.
So these questions would best be handled by Erin, you think, policy?
Again, Erin, she can't really speak on behalf of the entire council. She can only speak on behalf of Council Member Mosqueda, but Council Member Mosqueda all of the councilors are involved in these issues, but I think Council Member Mosqueda in particular has a lot of interest in this question. So I think you would get a lot of valuable information if you took took the time to invite Erin and have her talk about Council Member Mosqueda's viewpoint on this.
Do have a little bit more time for questions if anybody else
Sure.
has any.
Yeah.
I've got a question. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, good. And how does this play with the rest of the county? Does our planning commission, you guys meet with the people in Kirkland or the people in Kent? Because the growth is
Yeah.
all over.
Yep. That's a great question. The short answer is no, we don't. Well, let me rephrase that. We do occasionally in an informal way engage with planning commissions from other cities, but they tend to be a little further afield. For example, we have engaged with Portland's planning commission. Portland, they recently enacted legislation called the Residential Infill Project, which did allow for greater flexibility in almost all of the city's residential zones, which were formerly referred to as single family zones. And we talked to them about the lessons learned there, particularly as it applies to things like displacement. And the Residential Infill Project has some interesting strategies in terms of displacement. One is they allow for more units on a parcel if two of those units are affordable for a stipulated period of time as at a stipulated level of affordability. And the idea there, as I understand it, was to allow organizations like community land trusts and limited equity cooperatives, which are very interested in long-term affordable home ownership, to be able to compete with market rate developers within these neighborhoods. And so we're actually following that pretty closely to see how well it works. When cities look at these issues and hire these consultants to analyze different strategies, they do all sorts of sophisticated computer modeling to try to predict what's actually going to happen. But you can't really know exactly what's going to happen. You have to wait and see what happens and adjust policies accordingly. But back to the question, you're absolutely right. This is more than Seattle. This is a regional issue. And I am part of another group completely independent of the Planning Commission. So I've taken off my Planning Commission hat. I'm part of a group called Sound Communities, which is a volunteer group that is focused on leveraging our region's $60 billion investment in light rail and bus rapid transit to ensure that we build complete walkable neighborhoods with a substantial amount of both market rate and affordable housing in station areas, especially light rail station areas. And so we're working on getting state legislation passed that would create what are called housing benefit districts. And the housing benefit district would do a number of things, but one of the things that it would do is buy land in advance of the station opening and hold that land for affordable housing development. So in other words, because land, the closer you get to a station opening and then after a station opens, the land values increase. And so this is basically a land banking strategy for affordable housing. And so we're currently working with the cities of Everett, Renton, and Tacoma. Looking at this, we are hopeful that we're going to get the legislation passed this year. But you're absolutely right. This is the housing crisis is a regional one. It needs to be looked at both locally, neighborhood by neighborhood, and it needs to be looked at regionally, city by city. And we have an extraordinary opportunity here in our 4-county region because we're in the process of building the largest public transit project in the country right now. And we have an extraordinary opportunity to leverage that, but it won't happen automatically. At least that's our opinion in Sound Communities, that we really feel that that there needs to be a mechanism to intervene to ensure that housing is built quickly, that neighborhoods are well planned, and that within those neighborhoods is a robust amount of permanently affordable housing with access to transit, which means access to jobs and other services.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
I read that one of the concerns is that private equity is buying up a large number of the houses. They just have extra money and they feel they're going to make a lot of money. How would a group like yours compete with, these groups that
Yeah.
have millions and millions?
You're talking about like Blackstone and those
Yep.
sorts of,
Yep,
of,
that's
of groups.
exactly what I'm talking about.
That's a great question. Again, part of the strategy, and there is some sense of urgency here because every year is 1 year closer to a light rail station opening. One of the key strategies is to get in early, where the land is less expensive. The other issue, I mean, my understanding, and I don't know that much about it, but I've read about it. A lot of these private equity firms, they're actually looking for inexpensive housing. So for better and worse, I suppose one of the odd benefits of being where we are is that our housing is a little more expensive than what they're interested in. But that could change. But I agree, there are a couple of ways of looking at these organizations. In some cases, and I'm not endorsing them at all, but there have been cases in which the bottom, especially after the 2008 meltdown, where the bottom of the market literally just dropped out of certain neighborhoods. And they came in and they actually did bolster those neighborhoods by having that housing value just continue to spiral downward. But on the other hand, they are taking a lot of houses off the market for potential homeowners, right? And again, in our country, that is the primary way most households build wealth, is through homeownership. And so that is a serious problem when you have these equity firms taking literally thousands of houses out of the market for home ownership and instead owning them themselves as rental properties.
Thank you.
Rick, you used the term infill. Can you define that, please?
Infill usually refers to when you have an existing neighborhood and you are increasing the amount of housing within the neighborhood. And it could be that you are building a unit in the backyard and keeping the existing house. It could mean that you're demolishing the existing house and building more units that way. But that's usually what infill refers to. It was in Portland, the Residential Infill Project, or RIP. It's an interesting and curious acronym. I don't know whether that was done intentionally or not, but that's what they called it. And they were successful. They did get the legislation passed.
Right. It seems like the questions are dwindling and we are at 8 o'clock, which is around the time we like to try to wrap things up. So I'm going to say thank you from the community club, Rick, for joining us and
Sure, my pleasure.
Sharing your expertise on this. I know that I learned a lot and really appreciate it.
Thank you.